Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 4, Ninth Degree, Select Master 2 from Cryptic Masonry, a Manual of the Council by Albert G. Mackey. The Altar. The altar, in a council of royal and select masters, represents the celebrated stone of foundation in the temple, a notice of which will be found in a subsequent part of this volume. It should therefore, unlike other Masonic altars, be constructed to represent a cubical stone without other ornaments, and on it should be deposited the Substitute Ark. As the Masonic legend places the stone of foundation in the sanctum sanctorum of the second temple, but immediately beneath it in the first. And as that point is represented by the ninth arch in a council of select masters, it is evident that during a reception at least, the altar should be placed within that arch, and not, as is too often done, outside of it, or even in the center of the room. The secret vault. Considered simply as an historical question, there can be no doubt of the existence of immense vaults beneath the superstructure of the original Temple of Solomon. Prime, in his book, Tent Life in the Holy Land, and other writers who in recent times have described the topography of Jerusalem, speak of the existence of these structures, which they visited, and in some instances carefully examined. After the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus, the Roman Emperor Hadrian erected on the site of the House of the Lord a temple of Venus, which in its turn was destroyed, and the place subsequently became a depository of all manner of filth. But the Caliph Omar, after his conquest of Jerusalem, sought out the ancient site, and having caused it to be cleaned of its impurities, he directed a mosque to be erected on the rock which rises in the center of the mountain. 50 years afterwards, the Sultan Abd el-Muluk displaced the edifice of Omar and erected that splendid building which remains to this day and is still incorrectly called by Christians the Mosque of Omar, but known to Muslims as El Kubet es-Sukra, or the Dome of the Rock. This is supposed to occupy the exact site of the original Solomonic temple and is viewed with equal reverence by Jews and Mohammedans, the former of which, says Mr. Price, have a faith that the Ark is within its bosom now. Bartlett, in describing a vault beneath this Mosque of Omar, says, "Beneath the dome, at the southeast angle of the temple wall, conspicuous from all points, is a small subterraneous place of prayer forming the entrance to the extensive vaults which support the level platform of the mosque above." Dr. Barclay describes, in many places of his interesting topography of Jerusalem, the vaults and subterranean chambers which are to be found beneath the site of the old temple. Conformably with this historical account is the Talmudical legend, in which the Jewish rabbins state that in preparing the foundations of the temple, the workmen discovered a subterranean vault sustained by 7 arches rising from as many pairs of pillars. This vault escaped notice at the destruction of Jerusalem in consequence of its being filled with rubbish. The legend adds that Josiah, foreseeing the destruction of the temple, commanded the Levites to deposit the Ark of the Covenant in this vault, where it was found by some of the workmen of Zerubbabel at the building of the second temple. In the earliest ages, the cave or vault was deemed sacred. The first worship was in cave temples, which were either natural or formed by art to resemble the excavations of nature. Of such great extent was this practice of subterranean worship by the nations of antiquity that in many of the forms of heathen temples, as well as in the naves, aisles, and chancels of churches subsequently built for Christian worship, are said to owe their origin to the religious use of caves. From this too arose the fact that the initiation into the ancient mysteries was almost always performed in subterranean edifices. And when the place of initiation, as in some of the Egyptian temples, was really above ground, it was so constructed as to give to the neophyte the appearance, in its approaches and its internal structure, of a vault. As the great doctrine taught in the mysteries was the resurrection from the dead, as to die and to be initiated were synonymous terms, it was deemed proper that there should be some formal resemblance between a descent into the grave and a descent into the place of initiation. "Happy is the man," says the Greek poet Pindar, "who descends beneath the hollow earth, having beheld these mysteries, for he knows the end as well as the divine origin of life." And in a like spirit, Sophocles exclaims, "Thrice happy are they who descend to the shades below after having beheld these sacred rites, for they alone have life in Hades, while all others suffer there every kind of evil. The vault was therefore in the ancient mysteries symbolic of the grave, for initiation was symbolic of death, where alone divine truth is to be found. The Masons have adopted the same idea. They teach that death is but their beginning of life, that if the first or evanescent temple of our transitory life be on the surface, we must descend in the secret vault of death before we can find that sacred deposit of truth which is to adorn our second temple of eternal life. Looking therefore to this reference of initiation to that subterranean house of our last dwelling, we significantly speak of the place of initiation as the secret vault, where reigns silence, secrecy, and darkness. It is in this sense of an entrance through the grave into eternal life that the select master is to view the recondite but beautiful symbolism of the secret vault. Like every other myth and allegory of Masonry, the historical relation may be true or it may be false. It may be founded on fact or the invention of imagination. The lesson is still there, and the symbolism teaches it exclusive of the history. Achishar. This is the person named in the first book of Kings 4:6 under the name of Achishar, and they're described as being over the household of King Solomon. Adam Clarke describes him as the king's chamberlain, but the original title of Albeit properly signifies, as Gesenius remarks, the dispenser or steward who had charge of the household affairs and of the other servants. The very same words are used in Genesis 44:1, and they're translated the steward of his house. Achishar is therefore properly described in this degree as the steward of the household. As to the legend of his conduct and his punishment, it has no known foundation in history and may be considered as a mythical symbol. Isabud. This, like Achishar, is an historical personage, although the events recorded of him as peculiar to this degree are altogether legendary. The word is one of those corruptions of Hebrew names unfortunately too common in Masonry. The true name is Zabud, and he is mentioned in the first book of Kings 4:5, where it is said Zabud, the son of Nathan, was principal officer and the king's friend. Kitto, in his Cyclopedia of Biblical Literature, says of Zabud and of his brother Azariah that their advancement in the household of King Solomon may doubtless be ascribed not only to the young king's respect for the venerable prophet, their father, who had been his instructor, but to the friendship he had contracted with his sons during the course of education. The office, or rather honor of friend of the king, we find in all the despotic governments of the East. It gives high power without the public responsibility which the holding of a regular office in the state necessarily imposes. It implies the possession of the utmost confidence of and familiar intercourse with the monarch, to whose person the friend at all times has access and whose influence is therefore often far greater, even in matters of state, than that of the recognized ministers of government. It is scarcely necessary to say how closely all this has been observed in the legend of the select master's degree. It is time, however, that the word Zabud should be substituted for the corrupt form Isabud, now constantly used. Chiist. This word, which is most generally corrupted into hesed, is the Hebrew hesed and signifies mercy. Hence it very appropriately refers to that act of kindness and compassion which is commemorated in this degree. Ish Sodi. This expression is composed of the two Hebrew words ish and sod. The first of these words, ish, means a man, and sod signifies primarily a couch on which one reclines. Hence, Ish Sodi would mean, first a man of my couch, one who reclines with me on the same seat, an indication of great familiarity and confidence. Thence followed the secondary meaning given to sod of familiar intercourse, consultation, or intimacy. Job 19:19 applies it in this sense when, using Mackey, a word synonymous with Ish, he speaks of Mati Sodi in the passage which the common version has translated thus: "All my inward friends abhorred me," but which the marginal interpretation has more correctly rendered, "all the men of my secret." Ish Sodi, therefore, in this degree, very clearly means a man of my intimate counsel, a man of my choice, one selected to share with me a secret task or labor. Such was the position of every select master to King Solomon, and in this view those are not wrong who have interpreted Ish Sodi as meaning a select master. The Substitute Ark. The Ark or coffer, which necessarily constitutes a part of the paraphernalia of a council of select masters, is the same as that which forms a part of the furniture of a chapter of the Royal Arch. But it must be distinctly understood that neither of these represents that Ark of the Covenant which had been constructed in the wilderness by Moses, Aholiab, and Bezaleel, which had been placed in the tabernacle and afterwards, at the dedication of the Temple of Solomon, was removed to the Holy of Holies. The later history of this ark is buried in obscurity. It is supposed that upon the destruction of the first temple by the Chaldeans, it was carried to Babylon among the sacred utensils which became the spoil of the conquerors. But of its subsequent fate all traces have been lost. It is, however, certain that it was not brought back to Jerusalem by Zerubbabel. The Talmudists say that there were 5 things which were the glory of the first temple that were wanting in the second, namely the Ark of the Covenant, the Shekinah, or divine presence, the Urim and Thummim, the holy fire upon the altar, and the spirit of prophecy. The Reverend Salem Town, in his book System of Speculative Masonry, has endeavored to prove by a very ingenious argument that the original Ark of the Covenant was concealed by Josiah or by others at some time previous to the destruction of Jerusalem, and that it was afterwards, at the building of the Second Temple, discovered and brought to light. But such a theory is entirely at variance with all the legends of the degree of select master and of royal arch masonry. To admit it would lead to endless confusion and contradictions in the traditions of the order. It is besides in conflict with the opinions of the rabbinical writers and every Hebrew scholar. Josephus and the rabbins allege that in the Second Temple the Holy of Holies was empty or contained only the stone of foundation which marked the place which the Ark should have occupied. But Prideaux, in his book Old and New Testament Connected, on the authority of Lightfoot, contends that as an ark was indispensable to the Israelitish worship, there was in the Second Temple an ark which had been expressly made for the purpose of supplying the place of the first or original ark, and which, without possessing any of its prerogatives or honors, was of precisely the same shape and dimensions, and was deposited in the same place. These are historical problems which it would be vain for us to attempt at this late day to solve. The Masonic legend, however, whether authentic or not, is simple and connected. It teaches that there was an ark in the Second Temple, but that it was neither the Ark of the Covenant, which had been in the Holy of Holies of the First Temple, nor one that had been constructed as a substitute for it after the building of the Second Temple. It was that ark which is presented to us in the Select Master's degree, and which, being an exact copy of the Mosaical Ark and intended to replace it in case of its loss, is best known to Freemasons as the Substitute Ark. Giblemites. This is peculiarly a Masonic form for the more usual word Giblites. It designates the inhabitants of Gebal, a city of Phoenicia, on the shore of the Mediterranean and under Mount Lebanon. The Hebrew word is Giblim and is to be found in Kings 5:18, where it is translated in our own common version, stone squarers, in the following passage. And Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders did hew them, and the stone squarers, so they prepared timber and stone to build the house. The translation would be more correctly thus: and Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders and the Giblemites did hew them. The Giblemites, or inhabitants of Gebal, were subject to the king of Tyre and were distinguished for their skill as builders. The town of Gebal was called Byblos by the Greeks and was celebrated as the principal seat of the worship of Adonis, whose mysteries and the initiation accompanying it more nearly resembled, in its symbolism and allegorical teaching, the initiation into Masonry than any other of the ancient rites. It is not, therefore, unnatural to suppose that the Giblemites held a higher place in the confidence of King Solomon than any other of the temple builders. The 9 arches. Of all the superstitious notions which prevailed among the ancient philosophers, there was none more prevalent than that which attributed a mystical meaning and a divine virtue to numbers, nor did the idea die with antiquity. It was a favorite theory of many of the Christian fathers, and even so late as the 16th century, we find Cornelius Agrippa in his 3 books of occult philosophy asserting that there lies wonderful efficacy and virtue in numbers as well as for good as for evil. The doctrine was especially taught in the school of Pythagoras and afterwards by the Kabbalists, whence it has evidently descended to Freemasonry, of whose symbolical science it constitutes an interesting portion. But the numerical symbolism of Masonry very materially differs from that of the Pythagoreans, as well as the Kabbalists. With the Masons, odd numbers alone are considered mystical, which was according to the ancient doctrine where it was taught that odd numbers were pleasing to the gods, or as Virgil put it, numero deus impar gaude. The divinity loves the odd number. Hence 3, 5, 7, and 9 are deemed Masonic numbers. 3 is the foundation of the Masonic symbolism of numbers because it is the first odd number after unity, and it is particularly applicable to the lower degrees. When we ascend to the higher grades, 9 comes into play as the square of 3 and 27, which is the cube of 3, and lastly 81, which is the square of 9. The number 9 is the sacred number of the select degree, which however also refers to 27, simply because that is the product of 9 multiplied by 3. 9 was called by the Pythagoreans or the number of completion, and as such it is appropriate to that degree which professes to complete the circle of Masonic science. But the lecture of the Select Master teaches us that the number 9 alluded to the 9 attributes of the deity, which are said to be 1. Beauty, 2. Wisdom, 3. Power, 4. Eternity, 5. Infinity, 6. Omniscience, 7. Justice, 8. Mercy, 9. Perfection. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.